Hey everybody, as promised, here is the section on stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. So if you can believe it, we've only got 2 chapters left. This is chapter 12, and then we will finish up the semester with talking about cooperation and competition. But today we're going to talk about stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. So here's the overview for what we're going to be talking about here. So we're going to talk about social categorization and stereotyping, and we'll spend a bit of time talking about why stereotyping often happens. We'll then move on to talking about prejudice and in-group biases, and then we'll finish up by talking about discrimination and what are some different things that you and I can do to make sure that we are treating other people fairly. So one of the things that I certainly appreciate, and it's possible that you appreciate this too, is how much smaller our world has really become. Thanks to things like the internet and ease of international travel, the world has become much smaller than it used to be. And you are now a lot more likely to interact with people who are different from you than previous generations used to. And on a positive, this can give us a lot of new opportunities to learn from each other and things like that. But because you and I have a preference for what is familiar, and because you and I have a preference for things that are similar to us or like us, conflict and dislike of people who are different from us can happen. So I want to talk about some important distinctions in terminology. These are not necessarily interchangeable terms. So first, stereotyping is basically a positive or negative belief about different types of social groups. So stereotypes do not necessarily have to be negative, but as we'll kind of see, it's kind of flattening an individual and basically making assumptions about the individual on the basis of their group membership. Next, prejudice is an unjustifiable negative attitude toward an outgroup or its members. And then discrimination is unjustified negative behavior towards an outgroup or its members. So stereotyping often has a cognitive component. Prejudice has kind of an emotion or affective-based component, and discrimination often will have a behavioral component. And these do feed into each other a lot of ways. You and I may develop a prejudice and in-group favoritism. That because of that can affect our thoughts, and that can lead us to stereotyping. Likewise, it can cause us to treat people differently. If we think differently about other people, we may treat them differently. Likewise, if we treat people differently, it may affect the way that we think about them or the way that we feel about them. So these, despite not being interchangeable, are very intensely connected to each other, and they do feed into each other in a variety of different ways. Now, these stereotypes that we are going to talk about do exert various influences on us. And generally, if we are a member of a group that is an outgroup or a group that is less dominant or is not taken as the default, we are very likely aware of stereotypes of our group. And this can create what is referred to as stereotype threat. So one of the things that we find with stereotype threat is that if you are aware of the stereotypes of a particular social group that you belong to or a particular identity you have, those stereotypes can basically be highlighted and thus can create a lot of anxiety. So I want to give you an example. This comes from a paper by Spencer, Steele, and Quinn back in 1999. And this comes from the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. So one of the things, it's not necessarily a stereotype elsewhere, but here in the United States, there is this stereotype, I certainly grew up with this stereotype that math was not necessarily for women, and women did not do as well in math as men did. And so one of the so to kind of give you an example, a talking Barbie doll came out in 1991, 1992 when I was a kid, and people kind of made a big deal about it because one of the things that this Barbie said was math class is tough. And while math class certainly is tough, people were a little worried that this would further feed into the stereotype that math is too tough for women. So basically what Spencer and colleagues did, they actually did find that women compared to men, and of course this is only really looking at a gender binary. So people who identified as female versus people who identified as male, they had to take a math test, and they either took an easy math test or they took a difficult math test. And there were no gender differences on the easy math test, but women typically underperformed on the more difficult math test. And basically what they ended up doing is they tried to kind of heighten the stereotype in the second experiment. So they basically gave people who identified as women a test, and they said, you know, when we look at gender differences between this test, we don't see any. And when you tell people that there are no gender differences, it turns out you don't really see a lot of gender differences. The women actually perform very well on the math test. But when you make them identify their gender, and so they have to circle I identify as female on this box, and you tell them that there are gender differences. So you're highlighting the stereotype, you're highlighting their identity, you do kind of turn on that poor performance on and off like a switch. The idea here being that if you have to identify yourself as a woman and they highlight the stereotype that women do worse than men in math, now you're not just if you do poorly on the test, it's not just you doing poorly on the test, you are falling into the stereotype. So it's not just you that you're not just doing well for you, you're doing well for all women in math. And that creates a lot of anxiety and thus kind of creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so people have found this for a variety of different things. Women in math is just one example, but they have also found this with Black students and things like the SATs. It turns out you get better performance comparing Black students to white students when you basically tell people how you perform on this test is not indicative of your academic abilities in any way, because there are stereotypes about whether or not different racial groups perform in terms of academics as well. So how does stereotyping happen? So if we have this idea that women do worse than men in math and that different racial groups do worse in schooling, how do these things happen? Our minds generally want to simplify the world. Stereotyping often happens because of cognition. Our minds want to find ways to simplify the world, and this manifests itself as social categorization. Effectively, we are categorizing people into groups. And one of the things that we find is that this can be flexible. We can shift from the individual to the group or vice versa as conditions permit. But one of the things that really makes this difficult is that it occurs spontaneously and it occurs automatically. This is not necessarily something that we are born being able to do, but it is something that is kind of built into us by the information that we're exposed to early on in life. Now, here's some additional information about social categorization. This does occur spontaneously without much thought on our part. We do sometimes think about our relationships with others at the individual level, And sometimes we think about it at the group level. And which groups we use in social categorization can change over time, and they can change over different situations. So here's an example from your textbook. This comes from Taylor and colleagues back in 1978. Participants were basically watching a presentation of college students talking. They were looking at 3 men and 3 women. And then they got a memory test on which suggestion was made by whom. So who in this group made this particular suggestion? And the results were interesting. In general, if a woman made the statement, they might have gotten the wrong woman, but they knew that it was a woman that made that suggestion. Or if it was a man that made the suggestion, maybe they got the wrong man, but they didn't say it was a woman making that suggestion. So there were no cross-gender confusions. People were able to categorize by gender very easily, and researchers have basically found this very easy categorization. It also occurs with things like race, social roles, ethnicity, etc. So this is something that you and I do pretty easily. Now, social categorization can be really useful for us, and depending on the situation, stereotypes may contain some truth. So for example, there's often a stereotype that women are more nurturing. Now, historically, that is because women have often been put into positions of nurturing, regardless of whether or not they actually wanted to be in those positions. And men have often been regarded as being dominant. And again, that is not necessarily because men are more dominant, but because historically they have been put in positions of dominance. So stereotypes may contain some truth, but it's almost like we take that small little grain of truth and we extrapolate it far beyond what it needs to be. We can typically make fast decisions or fast choices or fast judgments if we're short on time or if we don't have energy. Oftentimes, we're going to rely on social categorization and stereotyping, not because we believe that that's how things should be, but because we may not have the time to get to know people as individuals, and it reduces complexity to basically sort people into different sorts of boxes. But as I've kind of mentioned, social categorization can be harmful. So part of the problem with social categorization and stereotyping is that we often tend to treat individuals from that stereotype or categorized group as a flattened character. So we will often notice the diversity and the differences in people in our in-group, but we often will find that people that are outside of our social group or the group we're identifying with, we tend to see them as being more homogenous than they actually are. And this is what is referred to as outgroup homogeneity. We basically view members of our outgroup as being more alike than members of in-group. My group has a lot of diversity, but those folks, oh, they're all the same. And we do this. We do this in a lot of different ways. We can do this for things like age. And it turns out, we have things like an own race bias. We have an easier time recognizing faces of our own race compared to faces of a different race. We have an own age bias. We have an own gender bias. We notice the variability in the groups that we are a part of, but we fail to notice the variability in groups that we are not a part of. And Linville and Jones characterize this kind of outgroup homogeneity by having people basically come up with different trait terms for members of one's own group versus outgroup. And again, kind of reflecting the variability that we tend to see in our in-groups, participants used a lot of different traits for the in-group, reflecting the variability that we see and we believe we have, but when it came to the outgroup, fewer traits were used, indicating again this flattening of the variability that will also naturally exist in groups that we are not a part of. So, with this in mind, and obviously this is recording, you're going to probably want to talk about these with some of your classmates or just reflect on this on your own. Which, if any, social categories do you characterize others? Why do you think you categorize? If you don't categorize, why don't you categorize? Is your behavior fair or unfair to the people that you are categorizing? So why does all of this happen? Why does the social categorization happen? Why does the stereotyping happen? And why do we get this outgroup homogeneity? Part of the reason is that most of the time we have a preference for our in-group and we don't necessarily have as much interaction with an outgroup. And if we do have interactions with an outgroup, the quality of those interactions is going to be a lot more superficial. And ultimately, what this means is that we don't get to learn about outgroup members or people that are different from us as true individuals. And when we don't understand outgroup members as individuals, when we don't see that variability, we're going to be more likely to categorize. Hence why the in-groups that I'm a part of, they're variable, they're diverse, everybody's really different, but that group, oh, they're all the same. So what happens when we assume that other people are all the same? What that means is that if you encounter somebody with that kind, if you encounter somebody who is a part of that group, you are going to probably apply a stereotype to that outgroup member, regardless of whether or not it actually applies. So for example, if I run into somebody who has never met me before and they ask me what I do, and I tell people, oh, I'm a college professor, they probably have some different ideas about what I must be like based on what they understand about college professors. So they might assume that I am absent-minded. They probably assume I'm intelligent. They might even assume something about the ideologies that I believe in, the values that I hold, or my political leanings. So whether or not those actually apply, if you don't really have time to get to know a person and you're having these very superficial, shallow interactions, you're going to be more likely to rely on those stereotypes. So the next time you meet that professor, you can kind of think about this as almost like a neural network that's represented into your mind. So I'm a college professor. It might activate qualities like absent-minded, intelligent. It might even activate images of professors that you have encountered in the past. So we will often find that we create things like mental representations. It might pull up different images or ideas, even if the professor does not necessarily fall into that particular stereotype. Now, what are the negative outcomes of stereotypes? So one of the things that I really want to impress upon you is that you are not a bad person for stereotyping. Your cognition is limited. Your attention is limited. And when you have these kind of limitations, you are more likely to fall into play for stereotypes. So you're not a bad person for having them. Having said that, though, now that you have an understanding of how these actually work, you can now think about ways to potentially counteract them or see people as individuals. And what we tend to find is that once stereotypes are established, they do tend to persevere. So oftentimes what we will find is that if you meet somebody who is an exception to a stereotype, what we often tend to do is we create a special little category for them. They're not like the rest of those folks. So we still try to, so Normally, running into somebody who wouldn't conform to a stereotype, you would think that would basically blow up the stereotype. I found my exception. The stereotype must be false. But that's not actually what we do. When we find somebody who's an exception to a stereotype, we put them in their own little subcategory, and they're not like the rest of those folks, or they're not like other girls, or they're not like other guys, or things like that. So we can hold on to the stereotype, but we have this one person who's different from that, and they get their individuality. So stereotypes tend to persevere even in the face of evidence that shows that they may not be true. And stereotypes are often going to be maintained because we often tend to focus on information that confirms our beliefs rather than those that disconfirm our beliefs. And information that falls in line with a stereotype basically tends to be better remembered than things that do not. So we've got some confirmation bias here as well. Stereotypes also are difficult to change because they're important to us. We have a lot of stereotypes that basically are put onto us very early on by the culture that we live in. Our culture values certain things over other things, and because of that, they become very important to us, and it's very hard to undo those things. They're often very highly cognitively accessible, and because they seem right, our stereotypes influence the judgments of and responses to people that we've categorized. The way that we think about things affects the way that we treat those people. And stereotypes are taught to us in a lot of different ways. First of all, obviously, some of our earliest interactions with our parents and our peers will teach us a lot about that. And also the media representations. Bigler and Lieben found in 2006 that young children are already very aware of stereotypes for things like gender and age and race and attractiveness. They probably didn't come into the world with those stereotypes, but the culture and the way that the media represents these different groups becomes learned, even if it's not something that we're consciously aware of. And additional evidence with this, you could say, well, maybe our parents taught us that. If that's the case, depending on the parent, everybody would have their own different stereotype, but I would say that the media representations are probably a bigger factor because we do find that in general, there's a lot of cultural agreement on stereotype content within a particular culture. And the fact that there's that agreement indicates that there's probably something bigger than your personal interactions with people that is driving those stereotypes. It's probably the media and the information that you consume and are exposed to. And stereotypes are largely upheld because they create a filter. As I mentioned, we have a predisposition for confirmation bias. We tend to ask questions of people from outgroups that only confirm stereotypes. We're interested in proving our stereotypes right and not disproving those. Moreover, information that fits our stereotypes are often going to be better remembered than information that does not fit the stereotype. And as I've mentioned, stereotypes in our culture are highly accessible and they're automatically activated. That means you may not even be consciously aware that you are engaging in these stereotypes when they're activated. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. Most people will not admit to having stereotypes or prejudice. It's a bad thing to flatten people down to their group membership and not recognize them as individuals, and many of our stereotypes are incredibly negative. And this is partially because of social desirability bias. What we do find is that yes, open prejudice is decreasing, but that's also because people recognize it is a bad thing to be. People are more worried about being called a bigot or a racist than actually having those bigoted or racist ideas. So because we know that good people generally don't have those kind of thoughts, we often will have to use indirect measures to basically look at stereotypes in other people. So I want to talk about two of those now. The first is the bogus pipeline procedure, and the second is the implicit association test. So I'm here in your textbook. I want to talk a little bit about the bogus pipeline procedure. So let me just scroll. So one indirect approach to assessing prejudice is called the bogus pipeline procedure. In this procedure, the experimenter first convinces the participants that that should probably be he or she, but I'm going to go ahead and say that they have access to their true beliefs. For instance, by getting access to a questionnaire that they completed at a prior experimental session. Once the participants are convinced that the researcher is able to assess their true attitudes, it is expected that they'll be more honest in answering the rest of the questions because they want to be sure that the researcher does not catch them lying. The bogus pipeline procedure suggests that people may frequently mask their negative beliefs in public. People express more prejudice when they are in the bogus pipeline than they do when they are asked the same question. Additionally, other indirect measures, we can assess nonverbal behavior like physical closeness. One common measure involves asking participants to take a seat on a chair near a person from a different racial or ethnic group and measuring how far away the person sits. Now, because stereotypes are automatically activated, another way that we can look at implicit bias is by looking at what is called the implicit association test. So I have gone to a website called implicit.harvard.edu. This is Project Implicit. So basically you can do different types of implicit assessment for implicit biases. So I'm going to log in really quick and I'm going to show you a little bit about how this works. So this was developed by Brian Nozick and others. I went ahead and I signed in as a guest. So I say I wish to proceed at the bottom, and you can see that there are a variety of different implicit biases. So for example, we have Indigenous Americans, presidents, so you can look at things like Trump versus Harris, gender career, and different types of identities. I'm going to go ahead and pick age. So I just want to show you a little bit about how this task actually works. So I'm going to go ahead and enter in some information, and then I'll show you the task. So I picked the age one. So we know that we have some negative stereotypes in this country about age. And so what you're going to have to do for an implicit bias test, you are either going to use two different keys to basically categorize items into groups. So you have positive words, negative words, old faces, and young faces. And I'm not going to actually go through this task. I would encourage you to check this out on your own. But how it basically works is you are going to basically just categorize each word on its own or each face on its own. And then what you're going to have to do, you're going to have the positive words matched up with young faces and negative words paired up with old faces. So the idea would be that if you see either a positive word or a young face, hit one key. If you have a negative word and an old face, press the other key. And then they're going to switch it. So if you have a positive word and an old face, hit one key. If you have a negative word and a young face, hit the other key. And the idea is that if you have an implicit bias for age, You are going to have an easier time. You'll be more accurate pairing positive words with younger faces and negative words with older faces than you will if those are reversed, because we do have a negative bias against older folks here in this country. So it's basically looking at your reaction time to those different pairings and reversing them to see where your implicit biases lie. Now, I tend to take the implicit bias tests with a little bit of a grain of salt. They can be very informative, but they can also be gamed. And sometimes the reliability of these measures is not as great as as we would expect them to be. However, I think they can be very useful in teaching you a lot about what sort of things you may have taken in from our culture, whether consciously or unconsciously. And again, your mind wants to categorize things. We try to simplify the world in any way that we can. You are not a bad person for doing that. However, now that you know that your mind wants to create categories, what are you going to do to try to make sure that you get to know people from different groups outside of your own as individuals? So folks, this is pretty much all I had. I'm not quite done yet. I have a couple of more slides, so let's talk about it. So, as I kind of mentioned, the main problem is that stereotypes flatten individuality. A stereotype may not be true of any given individual. If I kind of went in and said, psych majors don't like math, some of you would be really irritated with me because some of you really do like math. Some of you really are good at math. I was always really good at math, and it drove me up a wall when people assumed that I became a psych major because I wanted to be a science major, but I couldn't do math. No, I can do math. I just really love psychology. Stereotypes can also be inaccurate, and they create self-fulfilling prophecies. If we have this idea of how people outside of our group are going to act, we may treat those outgroup members differently, and thus cause them to act in ways that confirm and are consistent with the stereotype that we already had. So how do we fix this? Well, it's hard. Stereotypes operate outside of our conscious awareness. They are more likely with time pressure. They are more likely when we don't have sufficient attention. And they're also likely when we don't really have the energy to really get to know people as individuals. And it also takes effort and cognitive control to correct our thoughts and behavior. But I believe that when you have an understanding that these things are operating, and when you know how they work, you have an opportunity to do better. So that's what I'm going to leave you with. Next time we will talk about prejudice and our in-group preferences, and I'll see you when I come back from New York. Bye.